Depending on your own experience as an HR professional, how to become a Chief People Officer or CHRO might feel like a bit of a mystery. Or it could be that you have got a really good idea of how to reach the role, but the path to get there feels extremely daunting. So one of the reasons I created a special Chief People Officer series for this HR Coffee Time podcast was to try and make that career path much clearer and also to make it less daunting for you. It means that over the past few months, I've been interviewing Chief People Officers and CHROs about their careers, and we've been lucky enough for them to share their challenges with us and the lessons they've learned along the way, as long as so much other information about how they got there and what it's like being a CPO. The wonderful guest you'll be meeting today is Nicola Lyons. She is Group CHRO at the Getlink Group. And Nicola is a strategic HR and people leader with more than 15 years of international experience in driving organisational transformation, culture change and high performance for complex organisations. In this episode, she shares some of the most detailed and practical advice we've heard so far when it comes to the career planning and activities that can help you land your first CHRO or CPO role. And she also shares what to do to set yourself up for success when you step into that role for the first time. Everything she shares is so clear and so step by step, it's brilliant. Whether you're a new listener or you're a regular listener to the show, welcome. It's fantastic to have you here. I'll quickly say hello. I'm Fay Wallis, a career and executive coach, as well as being the host of this podcast. I'm also the creator of the Essential HR Planner and the Inspiring HR Leadership Programme. It's wonderful to have you listening or watching if you're watching this episode on YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. And before we dive in, I'd also love to say a heartfelt thank you to Kim O'Hare. Kim recently wrote such a lovely post on LinkedIn recommending HR Coffee Time, and she's been listening right from the very beginning, the whole 4 and a bit years that the podcast has been running for. So this is a big thank you, Kim, for sharing that post on LinkedIn. I really appreciate your support, and knowing that you've been on this journey with me this whole time, listening into every episode right from the start, it means so much. I'm so grateful to know that. But now let's go ahead and meet Nicola. I hope you're going to enjoy learning from her as much as I did. Normally, I dive straight into the very first question that I ask everyone who is a Chief People Officer who comes on the show, which is, how did you get your first CPO role? But your job title actually has got CHRO in it, which means that instead of Chief People Officer, you have got the title Chief Human Resources Officer. And I think that you're the first person in this particular series who we've had on who has got that title. So I thought I would be missing an opportunity if I didn't ask you about it. So can I actually start by asking you whether you think there is a difference in the job titles, so CHRO and CPO?
I don't think so from my point of view, Faye. What I have seen is perhaps CPO is becoming more popular as a job title versus the CHRO. I don't think in terms of job adverts that I've seen or discussions or events that I've been part of that there's any difference. Perhaps the slight difference is that I work for a French organisation and therefore my job title, which was set up in French, was translated back into English. So that may be the reason. I haven't seen an equivalent of CPO in French. I've only seen it in English. So that might explain the difference. But as far as the content and remit of the role goes, I'm not sure that there are any differences between both. Not that I've noticed in any case.
Well, that's so reassuring to hear, because at the beginning of each of these episodes, I usually try and say, for everyone listening, just to let you know, these two job titles mean the same thing. So I was living ever so slightly in fear that when I asked you that question, you might have an insight that I don't into how they are different. So it's great to clear that up. Thank you. And again, before I move on to what should be the first question, there's another question I'd love to ask you about your job title. And that is, your job title is actually Group CHRO. I think I'm almost certain you're the first Group CHRO person who we have had on the show. So can I ask you to explain exactly what that means and what the structure is like that you're working in?
Yes. So in terms of the group piece, essentially what it means is, so the CHR role is not any different to any other we may see as a CHR or CPO job title. The difference is that I work at group level, which essentially means that it is a group of companies within a group. So the umbrella is the group level, which is corporate, shall we say. And within that, we have 4 businesses. All of those businesses report into group. Each of those businesses has a HR director or a head of HR who reports into the managing director or CEO of that business. I am the peer of the CEOs of those businesses. So I work directly with the CEOs. I work directly with the heads of HR directors to ensure that the group strategy for the business is aligned and is executed in all of the businesses which form part of the group.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it makes me now wish that we were doing a whole second interview as well, Nicola, where I could ask you all about strategy and how on earth you get everything to align if all the businesses are different. But I'm going to have to save that up and hope you enjoy the experience today so I can somehow entice you to come back on in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. No need to entice me. I would put my hand up freely and voluntarily.
That's brilliant to hear. And I will definitely be holding you to that. So thank you very much. So now that we've had those 2 bonus questions, I will move us on to the official first question, which is, how did you get your first Chief People Officer role? And of course, it's fine if it was Chief Human Resources Officer instead of, as we've now established, that's exactly the same thing.
Okay. So in terms of getting my first CPO/CHRO role, it was via a traditional route. So essentially, I was contacted by a headhunter who talked me through the opportunity. However, what I would say, what was linked to that was that my name was put forward by another individual who happened to work for that executive search firm with whom I worked a number of years ago. So she believed that I would be a good match for the role, and therefore she put forward my name. I was part of a shortlist, so 3 in total, 2 other candidates apart from myself, and went through, I would say, a traditional interviewing process, and then was successfully appointed at the end of those interviews.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. And it really chimes with something that one of our earlier guests on the show talked about, which was how important the networking piece is when you're looking for a new role and how important it is to look after your network and pay attention to it. So it's amazing to hear a sort of real life example of how that's true. So someone who's worked with you before knows that you're absolutely brilliant, so puts your name forward. Had you maintained a relationship with that person, or are they thinking back ages ago to having worked with you?
So we hadn't stayed in direct contact, but we have a shared network. And I have some individuals within that network who I maintained close contact with. And therefore, I think that had a little bit of a ripple effect. But what it did do was that when I got the call, because as you know, generally people will receive a lot of calls, what it did do was it made me interested to speak to the consultant because I knew that they were from a well recognized, reputable firm because I had heard that from this ex-colleague previously a number of years before. So it opened the door, if you like. So it's another, shall we say, advantage to having a network where you get those insights and you get that feedback, which makes you feel quite confident about the discussions you can have.
That is really interesting because I hadn't really been considering it from that point of view before. That not only can it be great if you have a network behind you, as in they're going to put you forward and suggest you for roles or tell you about roles, but that it works both ways. So that if you are getting bombarded with calls from headhunters or recruiters, you may start thinking, oh, I'm just not interested. I love where I am now. But if that person is able to mention someone who you know and you trust their opinion, you're more likely to take the call and talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
There'll be so many people listening saying, how? If only I had loads of people calling me all the time, Nicola. I love how you said that with complete confidence. Oh, well, you get all these calls. I know there'll be lots of people thinking, no, this isn't happening to me yet. Have you got any tips or hints as to how all those calls start coming towards you?
I guess one of, again, network, but also perhaps making yourself visible. So attending events, connecting with individuals, posting on LinkedIn. I'm sure there are other channels as well that individuals can post on. That's the one that I work with. I don't do a huge amount of social media outside of that. So I would think, yes, the best way perhaps is to establish those relationships with executive search firms, with consultancy firms, perhaps through some projects or benchmarking, insight exercises, etc. It doesn't need to be an immediate discussion point, but those individuals could become quite useful in the future. And if you've had that shared positive experience, I think that's probably where consultants will look in the first instance, is in their immediate network to see if they already have that talent that they can contact, or someone who has a network that they could perhaps meet someone through that person. So it's like the knock-on effect, if you like.
Oh my goodness, that is so much brilliant advice in that one answer, Nicola. I could ask you loads of different questions now. It's brilliant to hear you talking about visibility and LinkedIn and going to events. I know a lot of people are really fearful of posting on LinkedIn or think, oh, I really should get round to it, but just haven't got time. But I personally think it can make such a huge difference just to be trying to post on there occasionally, because it's incredible how you see someone's post pop up and it just makes you think of them. So then if someone says to you, oh, Fay or whoever, who do you know who could be right for this role? You're going to immediately think of that person just because they're there front of mind. It's amazing. But I have talked about LinkedIn quite a few times before.
Mm-hmm.
And for anyone listening who's thinking, oh my gosh, I just don't even know where to start with LinkedIn, I have got a whole episode about that to help you. So make sure you watch this interview all the way to the end if you're watching it on YouTube, or listen all the way to the end if you're listening to it. And I will tell you the name of that episode and the number. I can never remember what any of the episodes are called anymore. Now we've got so many of them. There's more than 150. So I promise I will look it up and tell you at the very end of the episode. But aside from LinkedIn, you have mentioned something that has never been talked about on the show before. You said when it comes to building those relationships with headhunters and recruiters, maybe get involved with projects, get involved with benchmarking. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that for people who may not have had that opportunity before or haven't really come across it?
Yeah. So I think if we talk about benchmarking, there are quite a few, shall we say, consultancy firms or even small partnerships that are set up whereby you can either buy data. So we've got some very big organizations which you'll be familiar with, Faye, such as Deloitte, Mercer, etc. I mean, Towers Watson, there's a whole host of them. So those are the big names, but there's also lots of small providers out there as well. So you can go down the pay route whereby you're going to pay for data, and then you'll have a relationship manager who you will connect with. So that opens the network within that organization. They will then tend to invite you to free events, which is where you can further network. If you were looking at going down a network where you don't necessarily have that budget to spend, there are lots of resources and lots of connections that you can make online, predominantly in my experience through LinkedIn. But as I said, that's because that's the social platform that I would use for the professional side of things. So that's on the benchmarking side. On the event side, similar, there are lots of companies that want to sell their services or their products. So that's a good way as well. Even if you are not, shall we say, in a position to buy, quite often they would like to do demos. So then you can have an introduction and those conversations can continue because those companies are interested in creating a network of customers. So even if you don't purchase the product or service, they know that potentially you have a network who could be interested in the products and services. And therefore, they want to, shall we say, nurture and cultivate those relationships. And therefore, that opens another door to events, demos, etc. And then there are subscriptions which you can pay, some which are very affordable these days, notably in the UK, shall we say, which has a very big open market for smaller providers, which makes it more affordable, more accessible if you're not going with the big firms. And those typically are annual or ad hoc subscriptions that you can pay, and you will be introduced to a community. You will attend webinars, online events, and sometimes in-person events. So all of those opportunities, which are available to, I would say, all budgets, or even if you have no budget, you can find a way to make those connections and then understand what's available in the market. And then obviously reading. So lots of free online articles, etc., which are available, which can then help you become introduced to new topics and new providers.
Oh, that is just amazing to hear. I feel like I need to create a little caption or video to go on top of this video, which shows someone mining for gold. Like, you're just giving everyone these incredible golden nuggets of career advice that, weirdly, I don't think is normally hugely accessible. I wonder if it's where a lot of career advice isn't necessarily directed specifically for HR professionals. So just being able to share your experience with everyone and explain that this is how it works with these different providers, why it can actually be worth your time speaking to them, and open up your network and get access to all these events. So thank you, Nicola. I have a feeling I'm going to be saying thank you about 1,000,000 times throughout this interview.
That's because you're very polite, Fay.
I'll let my mum know. She'll be thrilled that you said that. Right.
Good. Always good to keep the mums happy.
Definitely, definitely. So, moving us along to another official question. I feel bad I'm blindsiding you with all these extra questions already. So, this is an official question you knew I was going to ask you, which is, for you, what has been the biggest difference between being a head of or an HR director and then becoming a CPO/CHRO?
Okay, so for me, I would say, despite having quite a bit of experience and having worked alongside a group CHRO in the past and being their deputy, there is definitely a step up. And I would say the step up is not necessarily in the type of work that you're doing, but it's in the decision making. Because ultimately you are the final decision maker from a HR point of view. So hopefully you'll be working with your team if you have a team and you're not in a standalone role. However, when the CEO asks that question, the responsibility will lie with you, and you will be responsible for ensuring that the strategy, the roadmap, HR operations are executed in line with the business goals. So for me, that's what I have experienced in terms of the biggest difference versus previous senior HR roles that I've occupied.
That really chimes with something that one of our earlier CPO guests, Kanika Mehra, said on the show. She talked about how important it is to sharpen and practice your decision-making skills, because she said a very similar thing to you. That is one of the most noticeable differences when you're stepping up into that role. Have you got any tips as to how you did that, how you became confident with making big, important decisions?
I would say in the first instance is that you're not going to have all the answers to all the questions, particularly if you've stepped outside of your organization and joined a new company. Because at the same time as taking on the role, you are also getting to know a new business, getting to know a new working environment. So that can throw some extra challenges in. I think for individuals who are promoted internally, it could be slightly easier because you already have that network established. You know how the relationships work. You know how the business operates. So that is definitely a challenge, is to get up, I suppose, up and running very quickly whilst you don't necessarily know the business very well. And just very basic things like, when you first arrive, how does the budget work? How does compliance work? What do I have authority to sign off? Who do I need to go to for the next level? So you need to get up to speed very, very quickly on, I would say, the internal compliance, governance, ways of working, to ensure that if you make those decisions are made correctly. So therefore, asking questions. And I think that you have a period of grace when you can ask quite a lot of questions when you've just started a new role. And hopefully that will, you'll find that you will be supported. And ultimately, whilst you are not expected to have all the answers to all the questions. What you are expected, I believe, is to know where to go to get those answers or know who to ask, i.e., you need to be solution oriented. I don't think at this level it will be considered acceptable to not be able to make a recommendation or at least put forward a proposal or a solution.
Again, there's so much you have just shared that I could dive into a bit more deeply, but there was one little element that you mentioned that I'd love to ask you a little bit more about, and that is the governance piece. So the very first guest that we had for this CPO series was David D'Souza, who's head of profession at the CIPD. And one of the things that he said he thought was a big difference, or that you needed to have when you moved into a CHRO or CPO role, is the governance element and the fact that you have got responsibility for that. And as soon as he said that, I thought, oh my gosh, I know that so many people will be thinking, what does that really mean? What does that involve? I've, not really had to think about that before. Who on earth would I ask? How would I learn about this? So as you just mentioned it as part of your answer, it would be great to ask you a little bit more about that. Like, how have you gone about doing that, understanding the governance element and being confident with it?
Okay. So the topic personally for me is not new because I've come from environments where we've had compliance, we've had governance, some fairly big international groups. So I do have some experience in that domain, working with legal, working with compliance, working with finance. So I would say they are your key partners in the business. So those are individuals who should absolutely be on your list of individuals to meet when you first join a business, or even if you are promoted internally and perhaps you didn't have that level of contact, is you need to make those relationships and you need to be curious and ask the questions. And as I said, I think in a previous answer, is that you have this period of grace when you can ask lots of questions because you've just arrived. So typically, even prior to taking on this role, I asked questions and I asked, it's a listed business I work for now. So I asked, what could I read up in advance so that I could understand the difference between the mechanisms here and the mechanisms in the previous organizations that I'd worked in, which weren't listed. And there's some definite differences there. So that preparation period, I guess, pre-onboarding, and then as soon as you arrive in the business, and also maybe making some lists in terms of, what is the limit from a financial point of view in terms of what you can sign off, how many signatories do you need to have, are there any corporate documents that you should read? Naturally, those should be shared with you during the onboarding period, but it's always good to ask in advance because that you can just gain some time.
This is going to be incredibly reassuring, I think, for everybody. Anyone who's about to start their first or maybe second or third or however many roles they've had as a CPO, I think is going to be enormously grateful to you, Nicola, for providing all these very practical questions that you can be asking before you start the role. And I'm also sure that if David ever listens to this episode, he will be thrilled that what you have just said is very similar to the advice that he gave on the show, which was to make sure you ask people. Moving us along to our next official question, it is, once you'd started your first CPO/CHRO role, how was it different to what you had expected?
Okay, so for this one, I would say for me personally, it hasn't been very different to what I expected. So I did have a career plan, which I've managed for a number of years in terms of what my next role would look like and what my aspirations were. So I built up over a period of time. So I had some preparation there. The other point I would mention is that I worked very closely with the Group CHRO. And as I mentioned, I had deputized for him on a number of big projects. We worked very closely. He was a very good coach. And I think, therefore, having watched him grow during a period of 10 years through that CPO journey meant that I'd had that time to see the differences between a senior role and the most senior role in HR within an organization. So to date, no big surprises.
How brilliant that you had him to learn from and see in action. I know that's something that so many people wish that they did have, is actually a mentor, someone that is doing a brilliant job who you can see in action and learn from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity, because I really do believe that inspired me and motivated me and supported me through, shall we say, that period of time when we worked together, and post as well, when we were no longer working together, because it had really set me up in terms of aspirations and also in terms of what good HR looked like.
I wonder if he knows. Do you think he knows how
He
much you
knows
appreciate that?
100%, because I thank him all the time. We're still in contact, but I will be sending him the link of this podcast when it goes live. So he will once again get to see my gratitude to him for being able to see the amazing work that he did during that time.
Oh, how lovely. I hope he enjoys listening or watching when you send him the link. Another thing that you just mentioned was the fact that you did have a career plan and that you were working towards it. Was that a career plan in your head, or was it something written down? What kind of format did that have? What kind of things did you have on your career plan?
So I would say it was both, Faye. So I had the thoughts in my head and I had the plan, shall we say, perhaps not on paper, but certainly on my laptop. I worked in an environment where we were modernizing the HR function. So as part of that, we set up different initiatives like mentorship, coaching, development plans. So each time something came out, I would put my hand up and work on it. And then I would use it for myself personally as well, to challenge myself and put some structure around those thoughts. Nothing complicated, some very simple things. For example, based on my annual appraisals or feedback loops, which points were strong competencies and skills, and where were the areas where I needed to develop. And I will always remember that one of my previous CHROs said to me that I was one of the few people, and for me, this seemed really obvious, but he said I was one of the few people who actually took what my HR boss and what my business boss from the business unit gave in terms of feedback and worked on it 100%. For me, that seemed like a pretty easy win, because you had the feedback, and therefore if you worked on that, then that will guarantee you some results and hopefully some opportunities. But apparently not everybody does that. And I heard that years later when I took up a new opportunity. So I try to each time look at the goals within the business, look at where my strengths were, where my development areas, and then use different mechanisms within the organization in terms of templates that we had. Nothing hugely complicated, but basically to get from A to B to C, how do I transform that thought into an action? And is that action measurable? How will I be able to get some value, shall we say, from those different actions?
I think it's amazing how often it's the simple things that can have a huge impact, but it's actually taking the time to ask for the feedback or listen to the feedback and then say, okay, if this is what I'm being told, what am I going to do about it? And I don't think I've mentioned this on the show in ages, but I have got something called the Essential HR Planner.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point of that is to help people think about their career and what they want to achieve over the next 12 months in particular. Now, hopefully, by the time our episode together goes live, Nicola, the 2026 version will be available to buy. And if someone is listening right now and thinking, I know it all sounds simple, but I just feel a bit overwhelmed, I don't know where to start, then I'd love to encourage them to take a look at the planner. And there's even a one-page personal development plan or professional development plan in there that they can use to help them. And for anyone listening who may not get feedback at work or may not get very helpful feedback at work, I have also got another episode of the podcast which looks specifically at this and how you can get really great feedback. And I will again make sure that at the very end of this episode, I will share the name and the number of that episode for anyone who's listening and thinking, I really want to be acting on all these fabulous things that Nicola is recommending, but might be feeling a bit worried about it.
Just as an anecdote, Faye, that's when I first saw your name years ago when you worked on your first HR planner. And I think at the time, if my memory serves me correctly, perhaps it was only an electronic version. Is that right? And you could download it in PDF format before you started doing this wonderful hard copy. So
Oh,
I would.
wow. I didn't know that you saw the very first version. Yes, it was. It was really, really simple to begin with. I think it was only a 19-page PDF that you could just print off at home. And then over the years, it's developed and changed. And I think it was the second year I had it. Someone said to me, "Oh, could you do a hardback version, please, Faye?" And I had no idea what I was doing because I'd never made anything like that before. But luckily, one of my lovely friends is a printer. And I said to him, "I've been asked if I could create this as a hardback, but I've no idea. Would you be able to help me with it?" And he did. He was absolutely fantastic. And yeah, that was years ago now. I can't.
I remember.
Gosh,
I'm showing my age.
No, I'm really thrilled. It's always such a lovely surprise when people tell me about the planner. I went to an HR event a couple of months ago and sat down, and someone sitting next to me said, "I've got your planner." And it's a lovely feeling because I create it to try and make sure there's a helpful resource out there. So meeting people who have come across it and used it and hopefully enjoyed it and found it useful is just amazing. So thank you for telling me.
You are very welcome.
Right, I better stop talking about the planner and bring us back to the rest of the interview now. Right, the next question is, which skills, habits or practices have most helped you succeed as a CPO?
Okay, so I'll probably have to rewind and talk about the CHRO who I worked very closely with over the years for a 10-year period. There were lots of things that I learned during that period, both from him, but also from the different business directors that I worked with. We had very, very different styles. And that was really, really useful because it helped me explore perhaps ways of looking at things that I wouldn't naturally have done. So it kind of opened my mind to observing and not necessarily jumping in with my thoughts or with answers, but doing the groundwork first. So some very, very basic things. Once again, I try to keep things as simple as possible because I think we live in a very, very complex world. And I think that sometimes we can get caught up in creating perfection when actually what's needed is something that does the job. So to give you an example, one thing that we used to do was we used to do a walk, talk and lunch morning, end of morning, beginning of lunchtime. 60 minutes tops, 45 minutes probably most times. We would have a short walk. During that time, we would go through our work task meeting, and by lunch, go back, eat lunch, and then by the end of that, we would have also covered off the development part of things. So I guess what I learned was that it's good to be curious. It's good to have open conversations, not just be focused on the here and now, and not just be focused on the traditional side of things. So opening your mind, being appreciative that different personalities, different styles can bring, shall we say, a more interesting dynamic to a team. And then once again, going back to something I said previously, which is building those relationships. So delivering and increasing your credibility and the team's credibility and the HR function's credibility through that delivery. And I always say that a lot can be forgiven if there is alignment on the why. So sometimes mistakes will be made, but if you have that alignment with your client or your internal customer or within your team, there will be hiccups along the way. But if you have built those relationships on trust, if you have built those relationships on we don't necessarily always see things the same way, but we have a common shared goal, then normally you can get over those hiccups and still achieve. It might take a little bit longer, but in the end, you'll be able to deliver. So I don't know whether that quite answers the question in terms of skills, because it's more about, I guess, the outside environment, because sometimes we can be a bit internally focused. And maybe my advice would be to open the horizon a little bit and not be afraid to discover and not be afraid to accept that there can be differences, but difference doesn't mean conflict, or it doesn't need to mean conflict. It just means that things are different.
The walk and talk meeting that you just talked about, that made me think of an interview I did recently with Dottie Day, who came on the show to talk about being an interim CPO. And we finished the interview. And then afterwards, she said, "Oh, Faye, when you asked me about well-being, I could have mentioned the fact that I do walk and talk meetings." So I said to her, "Oh gosh, don't worry, Dottie. It happens to us all. Whenever anyone does an interview, the minute that the recording finishes, you think, oh, I could have said this as well." But now I can reassure her that this piece of advice has popped up somewhere else. So it was good to hear you talking about the walk and talk. And it made me think I'm going to skip ahead one question quickly to move on to how do you maintain your mental well-being in such a high priority and demanding role? Because as you've been talking, I can sense, and I'm sure everyone listening can sense as well, that this is a busy job and there is pressure. And as you said, you have got to make very important decisions, and you may be operating in an environment sometimes when not everyone agrees. So it feels a really important question to ask. And I'm intrigued as to what your answer is going to be.
Okay, so I would say there are a few ways that I manage my health and well-being, or at least I try to manage it as best as possible. Firstly, acknowledging that this is a busy job and that it's important to take some time out. So I've got good organizational skills. It's something that I enjoy. It's easy for me to do. I love to-do lists. I love having a busy diary, and I love planning ahead. So I tend to plan things, and even if they don't go 100% to plan, at least I know I've got something in the diary. So for example, I run. I'm an amateur runner, so I plan my running schedule every week. Doesn't always go to schedule based on travel, etc. But I know that I've got that commitment, and I do put things in my diary, also in my private diary. So I'll put runs that I've scheduled with friends at the weekend or early in the morning. And that commitment, once it's in the diary, then really, unless I'm very unwell, I feel that I need to meet that commitment. So that's one side of it, is that kind of physical exercise, running, going to the gym, doing as much walking as possible, using the car the least amount of time as possible. So all of those things I factor in. From a diet point of view, so on the nutritional side of things, I try to be attentive to what I eat, and also caffeine, etc. So I tend to have decaf coffee mainly, just because I think it makes me a little bit more relaxed. And if I'm eating well, I feel well. And if I feel well, then I feel that I have energy. So it's kind of like a circle, if you like. It's really, really basic things. It's nothing that's too sophisticated or too difficult. But there's little tips, like when you're traveling, for example, I always take my gym kit with me. I always make sure that I have some healthy snacks. I make sure that I'm drinking water. So all of those sort of basic things. There are two other things that I've done also, is that I have reduced my online connectivity outside of working hours. So I don't spend a lot of time online when I'm not at work. I've gone back to reading real books, so hardback or paperback books. And I always have one with me when I'm traveling. And then I would say the other point is I always make sure that I have things to look forward to in the diary. So with family and friends, whether they're small things, like when will we do the dog walk? When will we do an activity with the children? When will we go on holiday? When will we see our friends? I always have at least a few things in the diary to look forward to, because that brings me joy, and therefore that gives me positive energy.
Oh, so many fabulous tips there. I really must follow that one about having healthy snacks wherever you go, because otherwise it's far too easy for me to go, oh, I'll just get this Cadbury's caramel to keep me going instead.
Other brands are available.
Oh, yes, other brands are available. That's my absolute weakness, those. I have to try not to buy them. They're too yummy. And what you were saying about planning for making sure you're doing nice things with friends and family, makes me think of my favorite time management book, which is called Tranquility by Tuesday by Laura Vanderkam. And she talks about that. She says, plan for the big adventures, but also the little adventures. So making sure that you are doing those little things as well as big holidays, because it's those things that help bring the joy to our lives as well. You can see it's almost impossible for me to get through an interview without talking about books. And I'm sure at some point I'll be asking you for a book as well, Nicola. But I had better bring us back to the actual questions that I promised to ask you. So the next question I need to ask you is, what is the biggest challenge you've experienced as a CPO/CHRO?
Okay, so I would say, because I'm relatively new to my current role, I would say that the biggest challenge that I have found so far, I'm just about in 4 months into my new role, is to avoid trying to problem solve everything. Because obviously when you arrive in a new role, you want to deliver, you want to create your credibility. This is a new organization for me, so they don't know me. So all of the things that I've done in the past really don't count for much, apart from the fact that they got me the job. Now I need to be able to transfer those to my new environment. So it's being able to create the relationships, as I said, which I believe is fundamental to succeeding, understanding the business, onboarding, understanding the ways of working, the tools, how things get done, and at the same time, understanding the priorities whilst not trying to answer all the questions or get everything done. Because I think that was a recommendation I received from my coach and from other individuals that I know, was to try to get that balance right. Because if you join day one and you immediately, shall we say, become overtaken by everything that needs to be delivered, then that whole period that you have, being able to see the organization from an external point of view, you will lose that. So that's been my experience so far. Not the technical aspect in terms of getting things done or understanding things, but more about taking a step back and not getting caught up in too many priorities from day one.
It makes me think of that expression, slow down to speed up. Such a brilliant reminder. I think that's an expression we could all do with paying attention to in all sorts of aspects of our work and home lives.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, you shared so much brilliant advice with us already, but I know that you're going to have even more brilliant tips. So I'm really excited to hear what your answer is going to be to this question, which is, what advice do you have for anyone listening who would like to be a CPO one day?
Okay, so I would go back to what we discussed earlier in terms of having a plan. And I know that word can be scary, or the word strategy can be scary, but if you break it down into thoughts, if you can visualize those, so whatever format works for you, whether it's a mind map, whether it's a list, whether it is an action plan from 1 to 10, to basically, one, understand, what do I know about the role and what is the role essentially, and is that the right direction for me? And then to understand where you're at today. So what have I done so far? Where have I excelled? What are my strengths? And what are the gaps? So if you were to look at generally job advertisements, vacancies versus the role that you do today, what would you need to do to be able to apply and do that role? I think you also need to look at the type of industry or sector. So where you have experience, where you're looking to have experience in the future, because sometimes that can be a little bit more complicated if you're moving from one sector to another and there are specific things that you could be required to do. For example, if you've only ever worked in financial services and you want to move into retail, how can you connect those two? Or, for example, if you've worked in the construction industry, but you would like to move to financial services, is there a link? So HR is HR. However, what I do see in the market these days is there seems to be a prevalence for finding individuals who have experience in that particular sector. Some sectors are more forgiving than others. So perhaps that's another area to look at. If it's your first CPO role, in terms of your wish list, what will you not compromise on? And what would you be prepared to compromise on? So, for example, location, sector, salary band, size of the company, size of the HR team. So I think once you've mapped all of that out, you can then have actions to say, for example, okay, one of my strengths is employment law and industrial relations. However, one of the areas where I've spent less time is learning and development. Typically, if you're looking for a CPO role, you'll need to cover all aspects of HR. So perhaps then you need to focus more on L&D than on employee relations and industrial relations, where you already have quite a lot of experience. And that could be through projects. It could be multiple, shall we say, channels at the same time, reading up, attending events, attending webinars. One of the best ways of getting experience and growing your skill set, I believe, is on the ground. So if there are any projects that you can get involved in that will broaden your experience, that's probably the easiest way, because you're already within the organization, you are credible. And generally organizations, if someone puts their hand up to volunteer, I don't know about you, but certainly from my point of view, if I see someone who's enthusiastic, they may not have the experience, but they're willing to give it a go, I will be very happy to onboard them on a project, even if they're just shadowing, etc., because it's a benefit for the organization and it's a benefit for that individual because they feel that they have the opportunity to develop as well. And once again, there's many things. I think today, whilst we live in a much more complex world than when I started working over 25 years ago, there are also many positive opportunities that exist that I don't believe existed when I entered the working world. Communities, events, podcasts, webinars, a huge amount of reading material, which I know you're very interested in because you're a big reader, and so many free resources out there. So we're also breaking that barrier so that it's accessible to anyone. So anybody who has that desire, who has that ambition, they can make that plan and then turn that plan into actions.
It's brilliant to hear that observation. It's so easy to forget how much things have changed. I remember when TED Talks first became a thing. I'm not sure when I first heard about them, maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago, something like that. And I just couldn't believe it, that there was publicly available information that was so incredibly helpful. Like, I didn't know that podcasts existed at that point. There probably weren't a huge number of them that anyone was listening to at that point in time. So you're absolutely right. We're so lucky to be in the world that we are in now in many ways. Oh my goodness. I mean, TED Talks, there's a billion of them, but now there's so much available from an HR specific point of view as well, which there just didn't used to be. I mean, the CIPD was still there, and of course they still are here and have got lots of resources for us, but it's incredible to think how much more there is. And you're absolutely right. You know that I'm a big reader, so I'm going to have to ask you, you mentioned there are some great books. Are there any books in particular that you would recommend for people to read?
So, yes, I think there are lots of great books out there. I think it really depends on what your learning style is, how you like to learn, what your appetite is as well, in terms of the level of reading you want to do. One piece of advice I received, so before we talk about some books, I received this advice from a previous member of my team who I'm still in contact with, who's actually based in Australia, a wonderful lady who's a HR consultant, and she's a big reader as well. And one of the pieces of advice she gave me was to do these summary reads. So she sends me quite often links to say, okay, this is a great book that I read, but I didn't have enough time to read all of it. If you click on this link, it will give you like a summary and you'll get all of the key points. So I think that's a fantastic way for people who are very busy, because we all know that when you are doing a full-time role or a part-time role, and you're also looking at your career plan or you're interviewing for a role, it takes up a lot of time. So that's one easy way, is that bite-sized learning through summaries. If you are the type of individual who loves to delve into a book, there are wonderful books out there. I don't necessarily have the best memory in the world for books, but I will recommend a few. I won't necessarily remember all of the authors' names. So there was one that I read, which was following an event by an Australian woman, which is called Hearts and Minds. So we'll have to look up who the author is, but I remember the title. The other one that I was recommended by one of my coaches prior to starting this new role was Your First 100 Days. So this is for anyone who is starting a new role and they need to do their 90-day plan, shall we say. And that is Niamh O'Keefe, who is the author. There is another one which we share. So you'll be familiar with this person. And this is another link within our network, which is Max McEwen. So this is not specifically about HR. However, wonderful, wonderful author who writes about innovation and strategy. And I find his books very pragmatic as well, because I think both of those topics can be quite scary if that's not your field of expertise. But I love the way Max visualizes things, and I love the way he makes things practical. And he's not afraid to ask the simplest of questions. So what does strategy mean? And really, he just breaks it down. What does innovation mean? And what does it look like? And I think those books are really useful as well for individuals working in HR, because I would say broaden your horizon and don't just read books on people, organization, HR. Read some books that will perhaps push you outside of your comfort zone, but you will see they'll bring you some value long term.
Well, what feels extra exciting about those recommendations, Nicola, is that we have had two of those authors on the show before. Dr. Max McEwen, actually, here's the reason I know you. He introduced us to each other. His book, The Strategy Book, is my most recommended book on strategy. I'm forever recommending it. And I was incredibly lucky to have him come on the show to talk about strategy. So I'll make sure I pop a link to that in the show notes, and I'll share at the very end of this interview the episode number and the title. And Niamh O'Keefe was one of the very first authors I ever invited on the show who wrote Your First 100 Days. I remember just being so thrilled that she said yes. I just messaged her through LinkedIn. I think that's such a great book. So I will also link to the episode with her. The Hearts and Minds one I haven't heard of before, but I will look up the full title and the author and pop that in the show notes as well. So thank you for all those fab recommendations. I need to remember where we're up to now. Right, we're coming near the end. I'm so grateful to you for spending all of this time with me and with everyone listening. Thank you so much, Nicola. So the next question is, what is the one piece of advice you would give to anyone who is about to start their first CPO/CHRO role and is feeling nervous about it?
I would say probably firstly, take a deep breath and acknowledge that most people will be feeling exactly the same. So it's not new, it's not uncommon. So just accept that's a normal feeling. And then I would say stop preparing. So prepare and plan. I would advise to do as much preparation as you can, because once you start the role, it will be very busy. As I said previously, if you can do some reading up in advance, if you can talk to your network, find out if there's anyone in your network who knows other people in the business, key individuals, members of the executive committee, etc. That will be really helpful, because that could give you some different insights into the company versus what you will be able to read in the press or what you've seen during your interviewing process. I would also say to do some homework on the CEO, who hopefully you will be reporting into as CHRO or CPO, and your colleagues who were in the executive committee, in terms of where they've worked before, how long they've worked for the organization, because that will just give you a flavor in terms of dynamics within the team. Any corporate literature that you can get your hands on in advance, or any internal documents that the company is willing to share with you. Some companies, if you sign a non-disclosure agreement, or if you sign an agreement to say, I promise not to share, publish, etc., this information, they will give that to you in advance so that you can read up and so that you're ready to hit the ground when you arrive. I would also advise new CPOs, CHROs to contribute to their onboarding plan prior to arriving. so that within the first day, first week, first month, which are the really important milestones, who you should be meeting, so that once again you can prepare for those meetings, as opposed to turning up on day one and not really knowing what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I would say speaking to some other experienced CPOs, potentially that could also help in terms of settling your nerves a little bit. Back to our third point, which we share, which is reading. So if there are books, for example, Neve's book or other books that walk you through what to expect in terms of the emotions that you may experience some fatigue because you've got information overload, or you're having lots of appointments with individuals and trying to pay attention whilst retaining all the information. So I think that can be helpful to guide you through the first sort of 3 months. And lastly, I would say in terms of your first week is be really pragmatic and draw up a list of where you need to be, how you're going to get there, build in some time to ensure that if there's any issues in terms of transport, that you're not going to be in a situation where you have to call and say that you're going to be late. Give yourself that time, and just basic things like during that week, what do you need to have with you? What do you want your first impression to be within in the business, and how can you bring the real you to the business from day one, as opposed to trying to put on this, should we say, mask or veneer, which will be difficult to maintain over time.
I know that everyone listening, especially anyone who's about to start that role and is feeling a bit nervous, will be incredibly grateful for those very, very practical tips, and also the acknowledgement that it's completely normal to be feeling nervous and that there is a lot of emotion around at these times. And that's not a bad thing. It shows that you're a human. So Absolutely. Incredibly reassuring. And that means that we are at our very final question, which is, are there any courses or qualifications you've taken that were particularly useful for succeeding as a CPO?
Okay, so in terms of qualifications, I qualified quite a while ago. I think I may have mentioned that number earlier on. So I'm sure that things have moved on in the market since. But I did my first degree, which was in languages, and then I did a postgraduate in what at the time was called personnel management. So that shows you how long ago it was. And then I CIPD qualified after that. So those were my, shall we say, formal HR qualifications. And then what I did over the years, each time I took a role, was that any time that there was an opportunity to join a program, perhaps pilot a scheme, a program, whether that be a development program, mentorship, coaching, whatever the initiative was, I always put my hand up, because I knew that one, that showed that I was ambitious, I was willing to try new things, but then also I could test those out for myself. And that's been really useful over the years. So I've done various development programs in various countries in Europe. Coaching, as I mentioned, I've been very fortunate to have lots of different types of coaching offered throughout the years. On the job coaching as well, peer-to-peer coaching within the organization. I've had a mentor. And essentially over the years, I've just added on, shall we say, different qualifications that either come internally through the organization or come through partnerships that we have with universities or schools, and added those. And they've been on like lots of different topics, very specific to HR. So for example, career frameworks, working with Corn Ferry, but then also more broader schemes, working with universities and looking at, should we say, management skills, leadership skills, and strategy. Today's market offers a much wider variety of opportunities for learning, for upskilling, perhaps outside of the more traditional routes that we would have followed in the past. And I do think that in particular, the UK market is very, very flexible. My advice to aspiring HR leaders or CPOs is to look at the market where you're working. So whichever country that may be, if it's the UK or if it's elsewhere, and understand what employers are looking for in terms of whether that be qualifications, competencies, or experience. And generally, there will be a trend within a given country, and then adapting your learning to that, so that when those job advertisements do come up, that you can demonstrate that you've got, whether it be qualifications, on the job experience, competencies, etc., that you can demonstrate that you do have that. But I do think that we're working in a much more inclusive, a much more diverse, a much more open market, very competitive, obviously, but lots of different avenues for individuals and lots of different wonderful organizations out there that are looking for brilliant CPOs to onboard and to be a member of the XCOM team. So I think there's lots of positivity in the market for those aspiring HR leaders.
That brings us to the end of today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed learning from Nicola as much as I did. And I'd love to know if there's anything that particularly stood out for you, or anything that you're going to try or that was especially helpful. You can let me know in the YouTube comments, send me a message on LinkedIn, or if you're feeling generous, you could always pop a post on LinkedIn about the podcast and tag me in. It's always a lovely surprise when I see posts pop up on LinkedIn. There are a few other HR Coffee Time episodes that you might find useful if you'd like to dive a bit deeper into some of the things that Nicola talked about. The first 2 episodes are about LinkedIn, actually. So if LinkedIn feels overwhelming or you're not really sure where to start with it, have a listen to episode 31, which is called 3 Little Known LinkedIn Features Which Will Help You Get Your Next Job. Or there is also episode 106, 7 types of posts to share on LinkedIn that will help your HR career. If you'd like some help with getting better feedback at work, because feedback is one of the things that Nicola talked about, then episode 78 is another episode you might like to dip into next. It's called 5 Tips to Get Useful Feedback at Work to Help Your HR or People Career. And if you're about to step into a new role, you might enjoy episode 37 with Niamh O'Keefe. It's called The First 100 Days Plan to Succeed in Your New HR Leadership Role. Niamh is the author of one of the books that Nicola recommended, which is called Your First 100 Days, Make Maximum Impact in Your New Role, and it is excellent. I would definitely recommend it. Then finally, if strategy feels a bit intimidating, episode 108 with Dr. Max McEwen is there for you. Max is the author of The Strategy Book, and his HR Coffee Time podcast episode is called HR Leadership: How to Create a Simple but Powerful One-Page Strategy. I think it's one of the episodes I've recommended more than anything else at all. I'll pop links to all of those episodes in the show notes for you and in the YouTube description, so they're nice and easy to find. Finally, if you've been enjoying the show, I would be so grateful if you could rate and review it for me on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Or if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe or recommend it to a friend who you think would enjoy it. Every rating, review and recommendation and subscribe, it helps more people discover the podcast, and it's just amazing to know it's reaching more people in the HR community and able to help more people. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back again in 2 weeks' time with another fantastic CPO guest, and I can't wait to share that conversation with you as well.